How's it going, my friend? It is Danny here from projectmanaverse.com, real world technical project management for beginners. And today I'm going to share with you some pro tips for preparing for your project test phase. I'll briefly explain what I mean by your project test phase. I'll tell you why this is important for you to understand as a project manager. And then I'll give you something of a checklist to prepare for your testing phase. So let's jump straight in. So what do I mean by testing phase, first of all? So as you go through your project, you have various phases to go through. First of all, you'll start with the design phase where you design the thing that you're creating. Then you actually build the thing, you code and develop it. And once you've done that, it's time to actually test it to make sure it works before you go live with it and release it to the end user population. So that's what I'm talking about, is that testing phase. And there's various phases of testing. I'll do a separate video on that. But you've got system testing, you've got non-functional testing, you've got end user acceptance testing. But the rules I'm going to go through, the tips I'm going to give you in this video apply to all the phases really, but they're probably most relevant and impactful to you when it comes to doing your user acceptance testing. That's when the actual end user of the product tests it for themselves before it goes live, because that's when you're closest to your project go live and when you're really going to start seeing those real issues that the end user would experience. So that's what I mean by project testing, and you should understand how it works and be prepared for that phase of testing. And that's important as a project manager because, number one, usually you would have a test manager working with you on the project who would manage the testing for you, but that is not always the case, and it may fall to you to manage the testing yourself, especially if it's a smaller project. So you definitely need to understand how this works because you might have to manage the testing yourself. But even if you're not managing the testing and you've either got a test manager working for you, or it might be that you've outsourced the testing to a different department in the business or a third party, you have to have a good understanding of it so you can have a good sense of how well it's going. You can track it and be able to challenge the test manager or the testing department as appropriate if you don't feel there's enough progress being made. Because if you don't have that knowledge and understanding of how it works, then you are exposing yourself. So you need to be kind of aware of how it all works. Another reason why it's really important for you to understand as a project manager is because the testing phase is the phase of the project where you get most of the delays. I see it time and time and again with projects. Of all the places where things can go wrong and you're going to get delays and your original project plan will extend out and start to slip, it's in that testing phase. So you need to be all over the testing to understand if there's going to be delays and how to respond to it and how to change your plan accordingly if you need to, and just think about how to react to those issues and mitigate them if required. So that's another reason. The last reason it's important to understand this as a project manager is because, especially in the user acceptance testing phase I mentioned, when end users start to use the product, that's usually done at the end of the project, close to your go live. And you might be in a position where you've got issues raised, the system is not working correctly. And when that happens, we raise what's called a defect. Process is defective, so you raise a defect for it. You might have some defects that have not been fixed or will not be fixed in time before you go live with your product. So that means these defects will exist in the live environment, so your end users will see them. That's not ideal, but sometimes you're in a position where you might have to go live with some of those defects. So you need to be very much aware of what those defects are so you can talk to the right stakeholders and the right business people to negotiate and get approval to go live with those defects. So those are some of the reasons why you should understand how this all works as a project manager. So let's now move on to the pro tips for preparing for the test phase. And I'm just going to talk about preparation in this video rather than the actual execution of the test phase. So number one, make sure you have a schedule. So you need to understand what tests are going to be run, and they're usually broken down by script. So you have what's called a script for each test. So you need to understand and have prepared in advance all of those tests written then you need to understand what day they're going to be executed. So you've got a schedule of what's happening throughout your testing phase. Now, you don't have to stick to it exactly, but you need to have a good sense of what's going to be done and a plan for it, so you know if you're falling behind schedule and your end of test milestone is not going to be met. That's really important. So that's tip number one. Make sure you have a schedule for the testing. Tip number two is be organized. Make sure you have some kind of SharePoint or software to track all the testing and all the defects, and everyone's using it, because if you don't have that, it can really cause massive confusion on the testing phase, and defects will get lost and you'll lose track of what has been retested and what has been fixed in what environment. It can get very, very, very messy if you're not very, very organized and all your documentation is top notch. So make sure you've got some kind of software to track it all and organize it. If you have to rely on Excel, which I don't recommend, then make sure you are updating it and doing housekeeping every single day to make sure it's all in top-notch condition, because otherwise you'll start to suffer, your project will suffer, and then problems will arise, trust me. Okay, next one is make sure you schedule actually before that, make sure you've got roles and responsibilities clearly defined. So you know who's doing what and who's responsible for what, who's doing the execution of the tests. And one of the most important ones is to get agreed who will be raising the defects if there is one. Because for some reason, just no one likes to raise defects. It's one of those admin tasks that no one really wants to do. And it's so painful on these defects calls when you say, right, who's raising the defect for this issue? People like to flag issues, but they don't like to actually do the admin to raise a defect, because you have to take screenshots of the problem, describe it, and it's just work. And it's really annoying when you get tumbleweeds when you ask that question, who's going to raise this defect? So make sure that's all agreed up front, who has the responsibility of raising the defect before the testing phase starts. And it should be the person that is doing the test themselves. If they're responsible for executing a test script and that test script fails, they should be raising the defect. So get your general roles and responsibilities agreed up front. Okay, next tip is make sure you have a process agreed for raising the defects and triaging the defects. When I say triaging the defects, it's a bit like war. You want to, before they're actually raised, it's usually advisable to have a conversation about the potential defect before it's raised in the system, because sometimes it turns out not to be a defect. It's just an environmental issue, or they're just not following the process correctly, or they don't understand the process. So you should have some kind of call where people take along their potential defects, they discuss, and if everyone agrees, then that defect is raised and we know exactly what the process is, what system to use, and all that good stuff. So make sure that is agreed up front, so you've got a good process for raising defects. As well as that, you should actually have a defect call scheduled, probably every day, sometimes twice a day is advisable as well, so you can go through the defects on that call, discuss them, and make sure they're being resolved and someone is actually fixing them. What is next? Another tip, make sure you have at the start of the testing phase some sort of guidance for how to classify a defect. When I say classify a defect, as you go through your testing and you raise a defect, it's very important to understand how serious that defect is. And we usually do that by assigning it a severity. And we usually give it like a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 severity, number 1 being the highest severity. That's usually when it's a complete catastrophe. For example, the whole system that you built is not working, no one can log into it, it won't turn on. That's a massive one, right? It's going to block everything. But it's up to you how you define the criteria for ranking the severity of the defect. Once you have the severity, it's easier to prioritize which ones you should fix first and which ones can be left till later. So you want to assign a severity and a priority to the defect. The priority is usually, again, ranked 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's very hard to prioritize the defects as a group and put each one in order, because you could sometimes have hundreds of defects open and you can't keep rejuggling their prioritization. So we tend to group them as priority 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So you know which ones to be worked on at which time. And often they correspond. So your high severities defects will be the highest priority to fix. But there are sometimes exceptions, which is why we assign both of those classifications. Okay, next is Again, general housekeeping, make sure all your testers, the folk that are going to be testing, and the engineers that are going to be fixing them have the access to all the systems you're going to be using, not just the systems where the testing is taking place, but also any defect management systems or software that you might want to use. So make sure everyone's got access right at the start, because it's so annoying when you're on day one of your testing, you've got your schedule there and you find people can't log into the system and there's access issues. There's always going to be a few of those, but you want to get rid of as many of those as possible to make sure you do that preparation up front. Give everyone access ahead of time, so when you come to day one of your schedule, you can actually concentrate on testing rather than sorting out access issues. The last tip I'm going to give you is make sure you've got a process agreed for deploying defect fixes, and there's appropriate governance to support that process as well, because as you go through your testing, you're raising defects, you want to make sure they're fixed as quickly as possible, but you want to do that in a controlled manner. And often you'll have several test environments on the go at once, not just one test environment. You'll have some kind of route to live, and a route to live is the sequence of environments that need to be deployed to before you can get it to your final, test environment for that phase. So you have like a dev environment, then a system environment, then your kind of UAT environment or your user acceptance testing environment. Whatever it is, there'll be some kind of route to live to deploy the defects to. You can't just deploy it straight to the main environment. You've got some environments that sit underneath that need to be deployed to first. So you need to make sure that route to live is established at the start of the testing phase, but also agree a schedule of when those defects are going to be deployed, or those fixes are going to be deployed, because you don't want to cause disruption to testing, especially if an outage is involved. So make sure those windows are agreed. Could be every day, could be once a week, could be twice a week, whatever you agree with your team. You need to make sure you stick to that and everyone knows what it is, so there's no problems as you go through. Okay, so that's basically the video. I won't do a recap on this one today, but I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, give it a thumbs up, please subscribe, and until tomorrow, please take care.